I am just tell me.
Yeah.
I'm here. I want to help you. And finally you did that. And I think that's when we kind of started having our breakthrough.
We hit rock bottom at that point.
Yeah.
Because I communicated it. Took her still another week or two to process it. And then once we hit rock bottom, we knew, okay, we could probably save this and build something.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, welcome to the 80s. It's great to have you here this morning. That clip we saw just before the music there is from a bonus episode on our podcast. If you're not already signed up, be sure to sign up, start listening to our podcast, gatewaychurch.com/podcast, or sign up wherever you listen to podcasts. And there'll be a bonus episode each week. Ricky Ecciona, our student and associate pastors, interviewing different staff. And that was Carlos and Libby Ortiz. He leads our North Austin campus. And you'll get to hear more, even more, on healthy communication. In this series, our hope is that you really kind of not just glean, but begin to understand how to develop healthy relationships. Think of it as free counseling each week. Not instead of going to the counselor, keep doing that, but insights that can help move things forward. And so you can also watch these episodes at our YouTube page. But if you're new to Gateway, welcome. We're glad that you're here. This is a community that loves everyone life by life. And that means that you are important to us. In fact, if you're new, would you introduce yourself to us? There's a QR code right in the chair in front of you. Just use your phone to fill that form out. Take it over to the Connect spot, and we have a free gift, a really good one. It's something you will actually like and not just re-gift. So be sure and let us know today that you're here. And actually, if you're not yet connected and ready to get connected, we're sharing lunch together. We'd love to have a meal with you, the staff and I, along with you and others that are new. There's a few spots left right after the service. Just let us know if you want to join us at the Connect spot. If you're new, you should also know this is a generous community. We love to give together, and what we give is making a real difference here locally. But also we have partners overseas in India, in Haiti, and even in Ukraine. In fact, our colleague, Kirby Holmes, who lives in Austin but also travels often to Ukraine, is back again, taking more humanitarian aid because of your generosity. If you want to give with the rest of us, you can do that. Just follow the instructions on the screen behind me. Well, our most significant relationships actually will determine the kind of life we lead. And if we can learn to communicate and learn to work through conflict in a healthy way, when we can spiritually align and create healthy family dynamics, it actually helps us enjoy life more, but also become more the people God's created us to be. And so today we're going to look at discovering essential keys in these relationships on communication in particular. We're going to try to answer some of these questions today. What does it look like to have healthy communication? What does this kind of communication mean for us? What does it mean for others that we interact with? And why does healthy communication matter to God? There's different ways that we communicate. And Converse Wilcombe from Drexel University writes about the 5 umbrellas of communication. It's important to understand all of these. First, she talks about verbal communication. This is what we say to other people, whether it's face-to-face, over the phone, on Zoom. There's informal, there's formal, like when we're in scheduled meetings. And it's not just about the words that we say. It's about what we say and how we say it. And then there's nonverbal communication, facial expressions, our posture, eye contact, movements, touch, written communication, an email, a text, a report, a Facebook post, a tweet. These are efforts to disseminate information. And some ways it's helpful for people to make that their main way of communicating, even with the people closest to them. So that you have it in writing, you can go back and see what you wrote or see what they wrote. But it doesn't guarantee that there will be clarity. And then listening. I thought it was interesting she included this on the list because when you think of communication, we don't often include listening. We think of what we want to communicate, but it's critical that we learn to be active listeners. The act of communication is a two-person street that both need to be fully engaged in. And then visual communication. And we see this all the time through social media, the television. Images are how we communicate to the world, and what we post matters, communicates something. There's another form of communication I just wanted to add to her list, American Sign Language. Did you know that there are more deaf people in Austin than University of Texas students? There's a lot of folks who live here who are deaf, and they communicate using 18 different hand shapes. But it's not just the shapes, it's actually the orientation of their hands. It can actually change the meaning where you place your hands. It relies on facial expressions, body shifts, movements, non-manual markers like raising your eyebrows, lowering your eyebrows, pursing your lips. Here's what she says, Ann Converse Welcome. To summarize, we communicate continually throughout each and every day. We do it without thinking. We operate on communication autopilot. However, I encourage you to think about how you communicate. Understanding how you communicate is the first step to communicating more effectively. So if today we can start to consider, how am I communicating? What am I contributing, or what should I contribute in this relationship? We'll move towards healthier communication. I mean, how many times have we watched a film or a television show and all the drama is just because of miscommunication? And you just want to shout at the screen, if you would just say this, if you would just sit down and listen. Some of you enjoy drama in life. But if you're like me and want less drama, healthy communication can help with that. Now, we're not going to be able to talk about all the different forms of communication. We're going to look at just two, and they're the two that are talked about most often in the scriptures: verbal communication and listening. Listen to what James, the half-brother of Jesus, the leader of the Jerusalem church, says, James chapter 1. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. I remember years ago hearing a guy about my age, another Gen Xer, a pastor, saying, I have two emotions, sleep and anger. And I remember thinking, that's kind of odd, but it's kind of true for those of us who are not emotionally connected, right? We're kind of laid back until we're not, and then it's explosive. But how often does that move anything forward, rather driving things apart? But if we are people who have faith, then we want to actually grow to become more like the people God created us to be. We want to become more like Jesus. And we can understand more of how Jesus related to people when we look at the scriptures. And we discover that God's view of how to interact is very different than our own. And when we begin to realize that God's ways are not our ways, that there are things in our life we need to change, need to allow him to help us change, we'll make progress. So first, we need to be quick to listen. Such a great phrase, quick to listen. How good of a listener are you? Are you actively asking questions, wanting to get to know the person, wanting to understand what they're trying to communicate? Or are you just waiting for them to stop talking so you can say something, all right? God models for us how to be listeners. Listen to the heart behind the author of Psalm 18 and God's response to him. I will call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised. So shall I be saved from my enemies. The cords of death encompassed me. The torrents of chaos overwhelmed me. The cords of Sheol entangled me. The snares of death confronted me. In my distress, I called upon the Lord. I cried to my God for help. From his temple, he heard my voice, and my cry for his help reached his ears. With all the anguish, all the overwhelming emotions that he felt, in that moment, he called out to God and knew he was heard. When you're in trouble, do you turn to God or away from God? See, I imagine God listening to us and interacting with us like a good father would. Well, I want you to see a great example of this in a video that went viral not too long ago. Let's watch.
Did you understand it though? No. Okay. All right. Huh? Oh no, not this one. This is the grand finale of it. Yeah, that's the last one. That's what I was wondering. I don't know what they're gonna do next season because they did some stuff this time. Exactly what I was thinking. Oh yeah. Right, don't bring that again. You know what I'm saying? Don't do the same stuff. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, I was thinking that. Yeah. Like go somewhere else with that, but don't bring it here. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. That's what I said. And then it was like, you know what I'm saying? And I was like, what in the world? But don't do that here. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Really? I thought the same thing. We think a lot alike, huh? Oh, that's crazy.
All right, great. Just so patient. Just you can see how much he enjoys just listening to his son. And it's a lot like us and God. We might think of ourselves as on his level, and we're just talking with God, but really it's just gibberish. It makes no sense. We're up and down. There's just all sorts of things we're trying to communicate, but we don't even really know what's behind it. And yet we have a God who enjoys just being with us, who enjoys hearing us and hearing our heart. See, our view of God cannot help but be affected by our relationship with our parents. Oftentimes, we begin to understand who God is by how our parents show up for us. I have amazing parents, and certainly they did the absolute best that they could, and I'm so and will forever be grateful for them. But I have to admit, I started off just completely enamored by my dad. I remember some of my earliest memories hating my blonde hair because my mom had blonde hair. I wanted to look like my dad. He had black hair. But then right around the teen years, the tween years, when I started to become a little bit more independent and pushing limits, my mom would say, if you don't stop it, I'm going to tell your dad when he gets home. And that would strike fear in me. See, at this point, my dad had come across more and more just grumpy and irritable and just prone to explode. Now, except for when we were on vacation, he was like a different person. He was so fun and hilarious. And in fact, his mother-in-law, my grandmother, referred to him as the white Bill Cosby, which at the time was a great compliment, right, in the 80s. Here's a picture of my parents and me just a couple years ago. But this idea of when we were at home, the fear of my dad coming home, it put something in me that I actually had a fear of God that I think was unhealthy. See, my view of God, though, began to change as I really sought to know who God was as a young adult. And I actually came to understand how loving and grace-giving God actually is. And that actually helped me give more grace to my own dad. See, I had a complicated relationship with my dad over the years. When I was about 11, he said I was too old to give him a hug. So I had to shake his hand goodnight. Good night, sir, Even as he would still hug my younger brother. And I would just walk off to my room so sad, right? But he was doing his best. In fact, he was far kinder than his father. I at least got 11 years of hugs, right? I don't know if he ever got a hug from his dad, a World War II and Korean War veteran, right? And then when I was in high school, I grew my hair out. This was the 80s, right? So I was into Striper and Rat and Poison, all the great one-word bands, right? The glam rock, right? The hair bands. In fact, here's a picture of me my senior year in high school. Yes, that's what a cool mullet looks like in 1990. But my dad got so mad when I grew up my hair. He just thought it was so disrespectful. If only he had known that I'd be bald about 8 years later, he may not have been so upset. But then when I became a dad, I began to understand him so much differently. When I began to understand personalities and love languages, I really came to a peace with Dad. In fact, it's not because he changed, he was just the same, but my perspective changed. I began to look backwards differently. See, my mom, she's overly enthusiastic and so positive, whereas my dad is more quiet and reserved and only extroverts his opinions, which come out as commands, right? Or extroverts his disappointment. And so my view of God was framed by that. But when I started growing to know that God, that's not how God is at all, I began to even give grace to my father and started to look backwards, realizing, my dad just didn't express love in the same way that my mom did, or the same way that I wanted to experience it. But you know what? If I ever needed to get somewhere in the middle of the night in a storm, my dad was one to talk to. And my dad was an air traffic controller. I mean, when you and I mess up at work, a few people might cry or get frustrated. When he messes up at work, people could die, hundreds of people all at once. In fact, it was a perfect job for him. He worked in the radar room, so he'd sit in the dark on the radio telling people what to do. It was just perfect for him. It was awesome. But these last couple years, my dad's health has really declined, and it's been hard to see him become a little bit more forgetful, or even in the last month, he's really taken a turn for the worse and has been in the hospital the last few days. He's dehydrated, and could be the medicine he's on for some of the things that he's fighting against. And I've driven out the last couple days going to visit him in the hospital. They live out in Marble Falls. And as uncomfortable as he is and as vulnerable and fragile as he seems to be, I still see glimpses of my dad, right? The dad I know best. And he's been retired for a while, so I get to see some of the vacation dad, right? And what was funny on Friday when I was there, he's very self-conscious, as he's on IV fluids to try to get rehydrated, so he's got to go to the bathroom all the time. And because he's kind of shuffling, the nurse wants to be there with him, and he doesn't really care for that. And so the door's open, the nurse is in there with him, she's looking out, but we can hear him, and my mom is in the room, and I'm in the room, so we can hear what's happening in there. My dad's very self-conscious. So he goes to the bathroom, and he comes out, and he literally, as soon as he walks out of the bathroom, says, "Ta-da!" It's like, see, I told you I could do this, right? I don't need all this help. But there's a phrase that I saw online a few years ago that I think really helps summarize kind of this idea of the connection between our parents and our view of God. You see, some of us have a more religious view of God. We see what we do is what will get him to love us. And so when we have a more religious view of God, the phrase, "I messed up, Dad's gonna kill me," is what first enters our mind. But when we begin to understand who God really is, when we have more of a relationship with him, we see how grace-giving and how unconditionally he loves us. A relationship with God doesn't say, "I messed up, Dad's gonna kill me." It's, "I messed up, I need to talk to my dad." See, I've had both those experiences with my dad. And I've had both of those views of God. How do you see God? Do you see him as distant, never approving, never happy with you? Or do you understand that he loves you unconditionally? And because of his love, you can turn to him at any time, in spite of the shame or the regret. Rather than turn away from him, turn towards him. Now, healthy communication requires a willingness to press through the discomfort. And the same is true in a relationship with God. It might feel difficult to confess to God, but I need to let you in on something. He already knows. And so when you confess, you need God's help, or you confess something you've done that you regret or that's hurt someone, he is so quick to forgive. And then learning to then forgive yourself, he can empower you and enable you to do that. And the same can be true in our relationships with other people. It might be uncomfortable to have the hard and honest conversation, but we need to learn to listen even when we're anxious about what they might say. And we need to speak what needs to be said, even when we fear their response. But when we can do that in the context of, I want to understand you, first and foremost, they're more willing, that other person at work, in our neighborhood, a friend or family member, a spouse, when they understand you want them to be understood, you want to understand them, they're more often willing to listen as well. See, God models healthy communication, as we saw in Psalm 18. We can be completely honest with God. We can take to him all of our doubts, all of our fears, all of our struggles, all of our emotions. He is bigger than all of those things. He listens and responds with comfort and unconditional love. And we can sense that God cares for us. And when we care for others, when we put their needs first, it's remarkable what happens. Listen to what it says in Romans chapter 12. Love must be sincere. Hate what is evil, cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Let me read it again, but this time a different English translation. Listen again to these words. Let them sink in. Let love be genuine. Abhor what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. If every one of us tried to outdo the other in showing honor, then we'd have healthy relationships. See, listening removes unnecessary emotions. It helps us get on the same page. It helps us not assume that we understand what the other person meant. It gives context to what's actually being said. And it gives the other person room to verbally process and make adjustments. See, what normally happens is, instead of being active listeners, instead of trying to understand what they're saying, we want to excuse, or we want to blame, or we want to avoid taking ownership. See, sometimes when people are expressing themselves, we don't have to immediately get defensive. One of the things that we do when couples are in need of help, they're in crisis, usually they're stuck in a trigger loop. Some of you heard me share how me and my daughter were in that space when she was about 15, 16. And so we started writing to each other. I wrote in a journal and told her, I love you, and I'm sorry I get triggered every time we talk. Sorry that I trigger you, but I care for you, and I want you to share any of your fears and concerns and questions and hopes and dreams with me. And maybe we should just write it to each other for now. A couple days go by, and I got the angriest entry in a journal you have ever read. So I took a walk around the street a couple times to calm myself down, and I prayed, and I was able to communicate. She knew she was being heard. And we used that for a couple years. I know of couples that the way they communicate is in writing so that they can take the time to process and pray before they respond. Because that trigger loop is what trips us up. And immediately when we get triggered, we're pointing back at all the times that they've messed up, proving that they've never loved us. And we rewrite history as if it was a stranger that we've married. When in reality, there was something about that person that it helped us say yes, or helped us ask them to marry us. My wife, Deborah, and I have been married 28 years. We got married quite young. And what's really funny about marriage, and some of you who are married know, opposites attract, but opposites can also annoy, right? And we're both so different in so many different ways. I'm an extrovert, she's an introvert. Whenever we're exhausted, we have completely different ideas of how we want to spend our time, because that's about regaining energy. I'm a thinker, she's a feeler. I make decisions on what's most logical. She makes decisions on how will this affect people, right? I love to come to closure as soon as possible. She is much more spontaneous and wants to process as much information as possible. So I've had to become really, really patient at restaurants. She reads through the menu a couple times. Don't go through the Cheesecake Factory with someone who likes to process. And so I've actually suggested, you know what, instead of praying when the meal comes out, do you mind if I pray right now as we get the menu? Just pray that God would give you wisdom, right? And she's had to be incredibly patient with me. The other day, we're both not very good with details, but she knows how to do the laundry, unlike me. This used to be a sweater for one of our grown children. They're grown-ups. They're 20, 23. Now a 2 or 3-year-old might be able to wear this, if any of you want it. Yeah. But she just gives me so much grace and so patient with me. And I'm trying to learn to do the same. There's been lots of ups and downs. There's been lots of challenges, but we've had mentors, people in small group with us that have been good examples for us, people we can learn from. We've been to counseling. We went through recovery, learning how to work through the wounds and find the healing we need to for those things that trigger us. And here's what we've discovered. Even being opposites is now something we see as a strength. Communication is now something we see as a strength. See, when you're opposites that come together, now all of a sudden you see the world more fully from different angles, from different perspectives. But one thing that's really critical about healthy communication, the relationship is more important than being right. Making things right is far more important than being right. So learning to be present, making sure that the other person feels fully understood, which leads to number 2, slow to speak. Sometimes reading through a longer passage of scripture can give you a fuller sense of what is being communicated. The early church, led by James, the half-brother of Jesus, he's writing to believers who are in the midst of some real chaotic times, and he writes this in chapter 3. Listen to what he writes about healthy communication. Not many of you should become teachers, my fellow believers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly. We all stumble in many ways. Anyone who is never at fault in what they say is perfect, able to keep their whole body in check. When we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we can turn the whole animal. Or take ships for an example. Although they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are steered by a very small rudder wherever the pilot wants to go. Likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue also is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body, sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. What do you really think, James? All kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, and sea creatures are being tamed and have been tamed by mankind, but no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. With the tongue, we praise our Lord and Father, and with it, we curse human beings who have been made in God's likeness. Out of the same mouth come praise and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this should not be. Can both fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring? My brothers and sisters, can a fig tree bear olives or a grapevine bear figs? Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water. You know, the Bible has 126 verses about the tongue, this muscular organ. Did you know that the tongue is much more intricate than people realize? It's actually 8 muscles that work together to provide multiple functions: chewing, tasting, swallowing, speech, clearing the oral cavity. And it's a great metaphor for verbal communication because verbal communication is complicated. We have to understand how complex communication is in order for us to best care for those around us. And because of its complexity, it's important that we truly and actively listen first. And then with prudence and at the right time, choose the right words to best set up the person we're talking to in the conversation, set them up for success. Are you someone who brings fresh water into your relationships? Or are you someone that might have a vantage point that is bitter and salty? See, when we look at the life of Jesus, Jesus was asked lots of questions. He was bombarded with questions, but he would always listen. And then he would slowly respond. Sometimes he would answer questions with questions. And his response may not always be what the person asking wants to hear, but it was always exactly what they needed. Listen to the characteristics of God. In fact, 7 times throughout the Hebrew scriptures, we see this description of who God is. The Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and rich in love. The Lord is good to all. He has compassion on all he has made. See, if you and I follow Jesus, then we want to become more like him. We want to become more godly, more like God. To be more compassionate, to be more gracious, to assume the best in others. To be compassionate, slow to anger, rich in love. And the Spirit of God can actually help us change. See, God says to listen and to respond slowly. And so if we try to do that this week, that's our way of saying, God, I'm going to trust you. I don't feel like listening to this person at work. I don't want to respond slowly to my spouse, but I'm going to try to trust you, God. If each of us is trying to take the proverbial high road in our relationship, how amazing will that relationship be? When we're having a bad day, maybe they will keep us on the high road and vice versa. As last week, the band is going to come out to lead a song for us to give us a chance to reflect. But I have one more story to share. This past week, we had a chance to go see a dress rehearsal for a new play at the Zach Scott Theater. It was written by a gatewayer, Alan Robertson. In fact, some of you might recognize Alan. He was one of the Biscuit Brothers. If you grew up in Austin, he's the one on the left there. They were on PBS for many years. But he's written and directed this beautiful show called Somebody Loves You, Mr. Hatch. You know how some people are the type that they don't read the book, they just wait for the movie? Well, I didn't read the children's book, I just waited for the play, all right? I'm not gonna ruin any of the plot lines. It's a beautiful show. I highly recommend it. In fact, you can buy tickets for it all month long. Just check out their COVID requirements. But there's an important lesson from that play and from my time at the hospital with my dad that I've learned this weekend when it comes to healthy communication. Sometimes God puts positive thoughts in our minds that we don't share enough. Sometimes the very thought that we have that's positive about someone at work, someone in our family, someone in our neighborhood is put there by God that we might communicate on his behalf. The encouragement that person might need in that exact moment. See, we need to be willing to listen actively. Help them be understood by asking good questions. But we also need to be slow to speak. And when we do speak, share the hope, the beauty, the kindness that God puts on your heart. Be a fresh water, bringing life to those around you, bringing encouragement. And when we do, we become more like God. We become more godly. We have a God who listens to us, who's there for us. When we lean into him in the midst of crisis and confusion, we can take all of our emotions, all of our fears, everything to him, and he will listen. And he will help us do that in our relationships. God is for you. He is with you. And he wants to use you to bring more of heaven to earth, even in your relationships. So I want you to consider, what are the next steps? What are the things that God wants you to adjust? Who are the people you need to apologize to? Who are the people you need to ask for forgiveness? Who are the people you need to spend time with and listen to them? Who are the people with whom you need to be a little bit more patient or not give up on? Consider your next step as you listen to this.